Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 121 for the 20th of Adar base in a leap year. And today we are going to be concluding chapter 37. And before we begin, I want to ask you guys a question. What do you think is more important, giving charity or learning Torah? So for some of you, the answer might seem really obvious. For some of you, maybe not. And maybe today we'll challenge some of your assumptions in either direction. So let's see. What we will learn about today is exactly this question and how this is an age-old question that comes up in the various rabbinical sources. And we're going to talk about how the answer is not that simple at all. And I think it can be helpful to see the context of this argument in light of what we've been learning so far in this chapter, and especially what we learned about yesterday. So please go back and listen to yesterday's episode if you haven't already, about the whole idea of enlightenment, namely the enlightenment of the godly soul, and how that is not the purpose for why it came down into the world. So yesterday we talked about this idea about how the godly soul is perfect in its own right, and the godly soul, the home of the godly soul is in the spiritual supernal realms. And when the godly soul comes down here into this world, it's a very grueling and difficult journey for it. And it doesn't come here for its own sake, because there's nothing that the godly soul can accomplish in terms of spiritual awareness or spiritual consciousness that it would not be able to accomplish to an infinitely greater degree in the higher realms. So why did the godly soul come down into this world? Why does it happen? So we explained that it really comes here for, not for itself, but rather for the sake of the body and the animal soul and for the physical world at large. So this is an important thing to really understand in terms of this context of what we're going to be talking about today, about these two different things, giving charity and studying Torah, and how they affect these different things. So we'll get into the text soon, but just to kind of give a brief summary of it, to support the argument for giving tzedakah, for giving charity, the Alter Rebbe brings a citation from the Gemara in Bava Basra, page 9a, which says, Sheshkula keneged kol mitzvot. So this citation in Bava Basra teaches that the giving of tzedakah is equal in weight to all other mitzvahs. And we know learning Torah is also a mitzvah, right? So it seems to be saying that giving tzedakah is really the most important thing that we can do that outweighs everything else. However, then later on, the Alter Rebbe brings another citation, this time from the Mishnah, from Peah, Mishnah 1, chapter 1, which says, Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that learning Torah is against all else. So there seems to be these two different views as to what is the most important thing, what outweighs everything. Is it giving tzedakah or is it learning Torah? And as we'll see in the chapter, the Alter Rebbe really gives a very strong, compelling argument for each side of this, and then attempts to bring about a resolution. So before we get into the chapter, I thought that it might be helpful if I summarized these ideas in my own words, and then we can get into the text itself. So the basic idea, so we'll start off with the argument for giving tzedakah. Why is giving tzedakah, why would we think of it as being the most essential mitzvah? To the point that we see that in various places, tzedakah is called mitzvah. Like tzedakah is made to be synonymous with the word mitzvah, meaning to say that it's like all the mitzvahs basically can be encompassed in this. It's almost like this like universal, all-encompassing mitzvah. And what the Alter Rebbe explains is he says that the reason for this is because when you think about when you do different mitzvahs, right? usually, most other mitzvahs you do with a certain part of your body. So let's say you are putting on tefillin. You're putting the tefillin on your arm. You're putting it around your head. You're using your hands to do that. Let's say you're lighting Shabbos candles. You're using your hands to light the Shabbos candles. You're using your eyes to look at the Shabbos candles. So there's very particular parts of your body that you're using to perform these various mitzvahs. When it comes to tzedakah, however, it's a different kind of thing, because tzedakah, the Alter Rebbe argues, you're using your entire body. Why? Because what are you giving when you're giving tzedakah? When you're giving tzedakah, you are giving your money. Where did this money come from? This money came from the sweat of your brow. Literally, it's your literal livelihood. Like, why do people say it's your livelihood? Your work is because like the hours that you spend working and toiling and trying to get this money, however it is that you do it, whether you have your own business, whether you work for somebody, whatever you're doing, however you went about attaining this money, this is your life. And now you are taking your life when you give this money and you give it to somebody else. So you're really giving over your entire life. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is even true for somebody who doesn't necessarily work for money. Let's say somebody who has a trust fund or something like that, or for whatever reason is being supported by their family or the government or something like that. He says, even in that case, this person is giving their livelihood because they have a choice. They could have used this money for something else. They could have used it for anything, really. And they chose to use the money to give to charity. So that means they chose charity over their own personal life. It's a very selfless act. So this is a very, very strong argument that gives a very compelling reason to understand how money truly is the universal, all-encompassing mitzvah. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is why the mitzvah of tzedakah is such a powerful mitzvah that it can literally elevate the animal soul in a way that no other mitzvah can do. So you give a little bit of tzedakah, that can elevate your animal soul to a much greater degree than would happen through doing a bunch of other mitzvahs. Okay, so that's the argument for tzedakah. So it's pretty compelling, right? It seems like tzedakah is the be-all, end-all. But then this is the Alter Rebbe throws a wrench in, and he brings up this citation from Peh that we talked about, how learning Torah is against all other things. So how could this be? If giving tzedakah is so great, is the most important thing, how do we reconcile this with this idea that there's nothing greater than learning Torah? And so the Alter Rebbe explains, because there's something about learning Torah that is very unique and that's very special, that has something over and above even what tzedakah doesn't have. What is it? Only the mitzvah of learning Torah do you involve your thought and your speech when you learn Torah. So you're speaking the words, whether out loud or just in your mind, and you're thinking about these words. And if you recall, we talked about this idea of how there are 3 garments of the soul. There's thought, speech, and action. So action is the external garment of the soul, and thought and speech are the internal garments of the soul. So the only mitzvah that touches upon the internal garments of the soul is the mitzvah of learning Torah. All the other mitzvahs, including tzedakah, really involve the external garment of the soul, namely action. So if we want to hit this internal aspect of the soul, we need to learn Torah. So it is something very essential and special. And the Alter Rebbe explains how, even though we learned about how when it comes to the animal soul, even for a Benoni, who's like the highest level of a human that we could hope to attain, somebody who has total control over their animal impulses and all of that stuff, they never really fully are able to transform their impulses. So the Benoni may behave perfectly at a certain point in their life once they attain that level, but they'll always crave on some level the things that are not good for them. However, even though this is true when it comes to the mitos, to our character traits, that we can never truly transform our character traits in a full way, when it comes to the intellectual attributes that we have, our chokhmah, bina, das, or wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, the intellectual faculties that we have, these can be channeled. These can be channeled and kind of like, in a sense, transformed completely into holiness through learning Torah. So when a person learns Torah, they're literally taking the intellectual faculties of their animal soul and they are elevating them and making them one with God. So this is a very, very profound thing. And this is something that nothing else can do other than the mitzvah of learning Torah. So it is quite intense. And we can see now why it would be likened to all the other mitzvahs. And so where we were talking about before, like the how the mitzvah of tzedakah is so special because all the other mitzvahs involve just like one or two organs or something, and the mitzvah of tzedakah involves all of the organs, the entire body. So learning Torah goes even one step deeper because it's going beyond the organs, because what is kind of like the vivifying force of all the organs is your mind, it's your brain. And so this brain of God is his Torah, basically. And so when we learn Torah, we are tapping literally into God's brain. So it's like above all, it's like the motor house of all the organs, so to speak. And even if a person might say, who am I? I don't really understand Torah so well. How can you say that I'm connecting with God's brain, with my lowly brain? Like we talked about, no thought can really understand God's thought, and God himself. God is beyond all thought and beyond all understanding. But nevertheless, Torah is a very magical thing that it's likened to water, where it can descend into very low places. Just like water stays the same no matter where it descends to, so too does the power of Torah have the power to descend into all kinds of different levels. And so that every single person, no matter how old, how young, how smart, how unintelligent, everybody can understand this same Torah on their level. So every single one of us can tap into God's mind, which is a really incredible thing. But then the Alter Rebbe goes back to the other argument, and he brings another citation to throw in another wrench. This is from Pirkei Avos, chapter 1, verse 17, which says, Lo hamidrash ikar el ha'maaseh, that the main thing is not learning, but the main thing is the deed. So again, this seems to indicate the fact that the main thing is action, and it's not just sitting and learning all day. And so now we are going to begin to come to a little bit of a resolution of these ideas, where the Alter Rebbe will explain how this works in halacha, practically speaking. Where practically speaking, let's say if you are involved in Torah study and then a mitzvah comes up that only you can do, for some reason nobody else is able to do it but you are obligated to stop your Torah study and go and do that mitzvah. However, if you are in the middle of Torah study and a mitzvah comes up that somebody else can and most likely will do, then you do not have to stop your Torah study, and you shouldn't stop your Torah study to do that mitzvah. So what is this all about? So the basic answer, in short, in brief, is that basically when we learn Torah, the effect that this Torah has on our souls is something that is greater than anything that we can imagine. And again, we're talking here about the animal soul, because the animal soul, when we learn Torah, what's happening is we're actually literally attaching the intellectual faculties of our animal soul, which is the highest faculties of our soul, and we are attaching them to God. And to God's mind. So that is something that is unparalleled in terms of the spiritual heights that the animal soul can attain. However, when we give tzedakah, it's not so much about this soul getting affected as much as actually literally transforming our body and suffusing our body and the entirety of our body with godliness by virtue of the fact that the money that we're giving to tzedakah was obtained through our literal livelihood. And we're using money that we could have otherwise used for other things to sustain our life, and instead we're choosing to give it to charity. So basically, in sum, this seeming contradiction is kind of like it's just kind of explaining two different things. So tzedakah is the most powerful thing when we talk about transformation of the body, but learning Torah is the most powerful thing when we talk about the transformation of the soul. So that was the little intro, and now we're going to get into the text. This is probably going to be kind of repetitive or somewhat of a review, but that's okay. Review is pretty good, I think. So here we go. So we're concluding chapter 37. And so the Alter Rebbe begins this section by saying that through this, we will understand the reason why the sages exalted so much the virtue of giving tzedakah, to the point that they said that it is equal in measure to all the other mitzvahs. And throughout the Jerusalem Talmud, so there's two Talmuds, just as a side note, there's the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi. So in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, throughout the Jerusalem Talmud, tzedakah is called mitzvah, like just a stam mitzvah, just like that. Because this was the common way that people would talk, that they would call tzedakah simply mitzvah. That's what they would call it. Why? Because it is the main mitzvah of the practical mitzvahs, and it surpasses all of them in terms of level. why is this? Because every mitzvah, the whole purpose of every mitzvah is in order to elevate the animal soul to God, which is keeping it alive and which is vested within it, in order to be absorbed into the blessed Ein Sof life, the light, the infinite light that's clothed within them. So this is the purpose of doing all the mitzvahs. And so remember, as we explained, we need to remember we talked about that whole discussion with this the smuggler, that the animal soul is very essential to the mission of the godly soul, because the animal soul is the one that vitalizes the body to perform the different mitzvahs. And so then the Alter Rebbe says that there is no mitzvah in which the animal soul is not vested more into, like in the mitzvah of tzedakah. So in the mitzvah of tzedakah, in the mitzvah of charity, the animal soul is the most vested within the body, is most vested within this mitzvah, more so than it is in any other mitzvahs. Because with all the other mitzvahs, then only one part of the animal soul is vested within this mitzvah. So, like we talked about before, somebody putting on tefillin, lighting Shabbos candles, saying a bracha while they eat food, before they eat food or something like that. It's like there's only a particular part of the animal soul that is giving life force to that part of the body to do the mitzvah. When a person gives from the sweat and toil of their hands, then this entirety of their animal soul that was vested within their occupation, or whatever it is that they did in order to get money. So however it is that they obtained money, their entirety of their animal soul was within them, was giving them life during that time. And so when a person gives tzedakah from this money, then the entirety of their animal soul gets elevated to God. The same animal soul that got them to get the money is now allowing them to give the money to tzedakah. And even somebody who doesn't necessarily earn their money through working. So we talked about, somebody who is a trust fund baby or gets money from the government or whatever, that kind of thing. Nevertheless, even though they didn't actually work from it using their animal soul to do this work, they could have taken that money that they had and buy all kinds of different things for their lives and for their animal souls. And nevertheless, they chose to take this money and to use it for God. And so this is why the sages taught that giving tzedakah hastens the geula, hastens the redemption. So that's from Bava Batra, page 10a. So the reason that specifically giving tzedakah hastens the redemption is because through one act of tzedakah, then a person is able to elevate their animal soul in such a way that is much greater than the elevations that they could have through doing all the other types of practical kind of mitzvahs, which only affect different aspects of the animal soul. So far we talked about the argument for tzedakah and why giving tzedakah is so essential and is kind of considered to be like the utmost mitzvah. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to bring in the idea of learning Torah. And he's going to bring in this argument. And he's going to say, so what can we understand about this idea? How do we understand this idea that the sages taught that learning Torah is equal in measure to everything else? So how is this? Because the Alter Rebbe says, learning Torah, we do this through speech and through thought, which are the inner garments of the animal soul. And also, when a person is learning Torah, so not only is it just affecting the inner garments of the animal soul, but also the chabad, which is the intellectual attributes of the animal soul, which come from klipas noga in this animal soul. When a person learns Torah, they are able to take these intellectual attributes of their animal soul and to have them become encompassed in holiness, truly, when they're learning Torah, if a person is really concentrating and thinking about these things. And even though, like we mentioned before, that the midos, the character trait, chesed, gvura, tiferes, so we broke that down another time, all the different emotional attributes of the soul, these ones, even the Beinonim cannot actually transform these into holiness because the evil within them is stronger in the midos than it is found within Chabad, within the intellectual attributes, because the suckling of the Chabad suckles a little bit more from Kedusha, from holiness. So the Alter Rebbe doesn't get into extreme detail about this here, but he's basically alluding to the fact that when we talk about the klipos, when we talk about this, how these husks give life to the animal soul. The main life that they give to is to the emotions, the emotional attributes, versus the Chabad, the intellectual attributes. They actually do receive a little bit of life from holiness. So it's not the time now to get into this so much, but this is basically the reason why the Alter Rebbe brings it up here, is to explain to us why learning Torah is so powerful. Because when we learn Torah, we literally can actually have our intellectual faculties truly connect in a real way. So far we talked about two reasons why learning Torah is so powerful. The first one is because only through learning Torah do we use our internal garments, namely our garments of thought and our garments of speech. And secondly, we talked about this idea that how the level of Chabad, the intellectual faculties of the soul, are capable of transformation and elevation in a way that our emotive attributes are not capable of. And now the Alter Rebbe here explains the third reason, and explaining why it is that learning Torah is so much superior to all the other mitzvahs. So the Alter Rebbe says that this is that we mentioned above, this idea that is mentioned in the Tikkunei Zohar, that the 248 positive commandments are parallel the 248 limbs of the king. So they are literally God's limbs. So when we talked about this before, like every single time we do a practical mitzvah, we are connecting with one of God's limbs in a certain way. And then the Alter Rebbe says, but if you look at like a human being, for example, and we see that a person has different organs, and then we look at the person's brain, the vitality in the person's brain is infinitely greater than the vitality within the other organs of their body, right? So, and we could even say that the vitality of the entire body is coming from the brain. And so too, this is what it's like for God, that basically for God too, he has his different organs or limbs, however you want to call it, that are all the mitzvahs and everything. But then the thing which is above all of them is his mind, is his brain. And so that is Torah. And just like the vitality that we find in a human mind is so much greater than the vitality that's found throughout the body. Like, the study of human consciousness and the study of the human mind, the brain, is really, even just in a physical sense, is something that remains highly, highly mysterious to physiologists and biologists to this day, as opposed to the rest of the body, which, we don't understand everything. It's not as cryptic as the brain. So too is the vitality of God's mind so much greater than the vitality of his organs, of just the mitzvahs. And then the Alter Rebbe talks about this idea that even though we're understanding Torah on this very physical plane, and each one of us according to our level, so it's like we're not really seemingly getting this pristine intellect of God in the true sense. We said that Torah is likened to water. So just like Torah can go from very high, just like water can go from a very high place to a very low place and remain intact and can remain that same water. So too with Torah, it can go from a very high place to a very low place and still remain intact. Okay, so far we brought up the two sides. So we talked about the side of tzedakah and how tzedakah is the most important thing, the main mitzvah. Then we talked about how Torah is really the main thing. So this seems to be a contradiction. So how do we reconcile these two things? So now the Alter Rebbe is going to go back to this idea of how the main thing is action. So this is that quote from Pirkei Avos, which says, Lo midrash ikar el ha'maaseh. And then also it says, V'hayom la'asotam, which is a quote from Devarim chapter 7, verse 11. So which literally means that today you should do it. So there seems to be a lot of emphasis on action in general, in Torah, throughout Torah. We always talk about action speaks louder than words and everything. So it seems like action is very essential. So how do we reconcile this with everything we've been talking about when it comes to Torah? And then the Alter Rebbe says that we even see that we are supposed to neglect Torah study to do a mitzvah when nobody else can do it. Because this is the reason why we were created. And this is the reason why we came into this world, to make a dwelling place for God in the lower worlds, to transform the darkness into light and to fill the entire world with the glory of God, this entire physical world with the glory of God. And every flesh should see God and should really witness God. However, if a mitzvah is able to be done by others, then we do not neglect Torah study. Even though what is Torah? Torah is merely just an explanation of the mitzvahs, the practical mitzvahs. So it would seem like if there's a practical mitzvah that we can do, we should just stop learning and go do that mitzvah, whether somebody could do it or not. But the Alter Rebbe says that no, because the Torah is the aspect of Chabad, of the infinite God. So Torah itself is God's mind. And when we are involved in this Torah study, a person draws into them this infinite light in a greater way and with a greater intensity and greater revelation than anything that they can get from the organs of the king or the limbs of the king. And then the Alter Rebbe here brings a citation from the Gemara from Sachem 68b, which says, Chadai nafshe lach kar'e lach tanai, which literally means, rejoice my soul. For you do I study scripture. For you do I study Mishnah. So basically alluding to this idea that there is a certain unity that we attain with God that is only accomplished through Torah study, that we can't get through doing any other mitzvah. So there's something about learning Torah specifically, which is really, really deep and profound in terms of the connection that we get with God. And the Alter Rebbe says that this idea is explained in this quotation from Rav Sheshet is explained elsewhere at length. And then the Alter Rebbe elaborates and he says that this drawing down, this influence that a person brings down into them from the light of the infinite light into their soul and into the souls of all Jews is the Shekhinah. This is the Knesset Yisrael. So we've talked a little bit about this. The Shekhinah is like the indwelling of God. It can also be thought of as like this collective soul of all the Jews. So this is the source of all the souls of all the Jews, basically. And the Alter Rebbe is going to explain this a little bit further, a little bit more later on. And then the Alter Rebbe gets a little bit into the etymology of learning Torah. So when we say Kriyas HaTorah, reading Torah, so we can say that this is like Kriyas HaTorah. We say this as like the reading of the Torah, but it really comes to the word koreh, which in Hebrew, literally what that means is to call out. So what that means is that when a person is involved with studying Torah, they're literally calling out to God to come to him. Just like a person calls out to their friend to come to him, or like a little child calling out to their father to come to him, to be with him and to be connected with him and not to leave him alone. So this is the whole idea. When we learn Torah, when somebody's doing Kriyas HaTorah, if you hear like in Shul, people do Kriyas HaTorah, the reading of the Torah, really what it literally means is the calling. It's calling to God. And then the Alter Rebbe here brings up a few poetic citations to support this. The first one is Korov Hashem l'chol korav l'chol asher kruv v'emet. So this is from Tehillim chapter 145 verse 18, which literally means that God is close to all who call to him, all who call to him in truth. So again, this thing of calling out to God is what's going to bring God closer. And another citation here, this time from the Talmud Yerushalmi, and it's in Rosh Hashanah 3a, and it also comes up in Brachos, page 5b, which says Ve'en emet el Torah, that there is no truth but Torah. So meaning to say that when a person calls out to God and call it through the Torah, they're actually literally calling out to. And then the Alter Rebbe contrasts this with the type of calling that we refer to when we talk about prayer, because we talk about when we pray as a way of calling out to God as well. But when a person calls out in prayer, this doesn't have the same weight of being a call of truth. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is what Yeshayahu, the prophet, was alluding to in verse 64:6. In chapter 64, verse 6, where he said, Ve'en koreh b'shimcha chole, that there's none who calls you by your name. So meaning to say that like the prophet was lamenting that everybody was calling out to God, but it wasn't in truth, because it's like it was just coming, not that prayer isn't a good thing, obviously, but there's a certain truth that comes from learning Torah versus just calling out to God in a prayer way. It doesn't have that same like truthfulness to it that Torah has. And then the Alter Rebbe just concludes this section here now, where he says that from this, through thinking about these things, that an intelligent person will cause an intelligent person to draw into themselves a sense of great awe of God when they are learning Torah, when they're learning Torah, because then they'll really be aware of what they're accomplishing in their soul when they study Torah. So that's the end of the section. And so it was a lot today. Again, a Wednesday. This year is always going to be a little bit longer than some of the other days. And so just in conclusion, I'm not going to do the whole recap again, but again, we had this question as to what is more powerful, what is more essential? Is it giving tzedakah or is it learning Torah? And it seemed at first glance that it really was giving tzedakah, and there really is a huge value to giving tzedakah. And we'll see that the Alter Rebbe, in fact, devotes many, many, many sections of this Tanya that we'll be learning to giving tzedakah, and he really valued giving tzedakah to the point that we can really argue that this is the entire purpose of our creation down here. However, nevertheless, and the reason why we were put here on this earth, nevertheless, there's something about Torah study that is even greater. And he kind of really, reading this chapter again, you really see that the Torah study in a way did kind of win out in terms of its power and in terms of its ability to transform the soul, because the Torah, unlike the limbs of the body, which are the mitzvahs, the Torah is the brain of God. So the brain is the vitality from which all of the other organs receive their vitality from. So this is something really just to keep in mind. And every day, if you've been following me in this podcast, so you've been learning Torah too. So you have been literally taking your intellectual faculties and connecting them to God in this way, and connecting your internal garments of your thought and your speech through learning this Torah, and you have been connecting to God's brain in this manner. So thank you for joining me in this journey, and we will continue tomorrow when we begin chapter 38. I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.